Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second part of the three-part series on the First World War. This time we're going to be exploring Versailles, and we have Mark Albertson again with us to take us through. If anyone came to the first lecture, thank you so much. We have a great turnout tonight. I think Mark is pretty popular, so we're very lucky to have him. And we have a donation box in the back, so if you have any change left over from coffee this morning and you would like to donate it to us, we would appreciate it greatly. Our donations allow us to bring you programs like this. Also, if you'd like to make a donation that's a little bit greater, we do have donation envelopes in the back as well. So please join me in a hand for Mark.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm just going to put this up here so I can. No, I'm not Jackie Gleason. This is T. Good evening. How is everybody tonight? Yeah, I know. I gave a talk this morning on the Russian front, and boy, this weather was perfect for that talk. Last night I was in the New Milford Library up in New Milford, and I was giving a talk on Dien Bien Phu, and boy, that cold weather was not for Vietnam. This is the second of a three-talk set on World War I. Last week we did the causes. Tonight, Versailles and the aftermath. And at the close of last week, I intimated or alluded to the fact that, World War I is, just to reiterate, World War I is the most important event in human history in the last 100 years. You live the way you do today because of this war. Not World War II. World War II is a continuation of the first conflict. Vietnam is a product of World War I/colonialism. Iraq is a product of World War I/colonialism. Libya, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Palestine, so on and so forth. These are all products of World War I/colonialism. The modern tragedy of the Balkans, World War I. The shifting of populations and the redrawing of borders in Eastern Europe, Eastern and Central Europe. It's all World War I. And I'm sure some people have probably thought, comes to mind, Ukraine? Yeah, you'd be right. You'd be right. This war just hasn't gone away here. Having said that, last week we did the causes. But I also intimated that tonight, starting tonight, I would ram home the idea that, yes, World War I, the Great War, it's been known as the war to end all wars, a misnomer if ever there was one, because as you're going to find out tonight, Versailles is the biggest fraud ever perpetrated on modern man. But also the idea which I do not think we really appreciate is that this war was a European civil war. That's what it was. Why? It was fought for European issues, wasn't it? Who were the main colonial powers in the world? Weren't they European? The British, the French, Tsarist Russia. The Belgians were still in the game. How about the Dutch? Dutch East Indies ring a bell here? Yeah, sure does. The Italians jump in the game. I talked about that last night and that debacle in Libya. The Germans jumped in the game. And let's understand this here. Let's understand this. When this war is over with, this idea, and you can see on that cover sheet, that handout I gave you. In fact, you ought to take a look at that cover sheet. It starts off with Article 231 from the Versailles Treaty, virtually consigning guilt for this war to Germany. And then follow the quotes down the paper, following Article 231 down to the bottom. And those quotes become more and more draconian as they go on. Kind of sizes up what's going to happen between 1919 and 1939, when Hitler actually jumpstarts this war with Stalin's connivance. I'm talking about the Hitler-Stalin Pact of August 23-24, 1939. That's when collective security as seen by Stalin with the European powers was actually empty, so let's make a deal with Hitler. And that's exactly what he's going to do, Stalin being an opportunist. And we'll get into a little bit of that too. But here at this time, you see, Germany was accorded at Versailles responsibility for the war. Germany and associated powers. They don't mention the Ottomans, and they don't mention the Austro-Hungarians. They mention Germany. Yet at the same time, Germany loses all her colonies. The British and French keep theirs, don't they? So you think this war was fought for democracy? Well, I'll leave that to your conscience. But here we see, at the end of this war, lining up for Versailles, you have four statesmen here. Four statesmen. And who are they? Lloyd George of England, Georges Clemenceau, the Tiger of France, who at one point was actually a reporter here in the United States during the 19th century. You know, he actually covered the Civil War. Yeah, interesting character, Clemenceau. I remember when he got an attempted assassination, he got shot. And he actually looked the assassin in the face, and he says, "The clumsy fellow, he nearly missed me." You got to admit one thing, he had intestinal fortitude. Another one was Vittorio Orlando of Italy. However, understand one thing of these three of the big four. They were all brought up in that old European balance of politics. And the one so-called idealist here is who? Yeah, Woodrow Wilson. Yeah, the American. Do you know when he came over here, there were members of Congress who wanted him impeached? He left the country. Yeah. Now this is interesting. This is America now taking its place on the world stage. Of course, the rudiments for that, you go back to the Spanish-American War, when America took manifest destiny and turned it from a program of continental expansion into a program for globalism. That's what we did, the Spanish-American War. We cut our colonial roots. We now became a power who once threw a colonial power out, and we became a colonial imperialist power. That's exactly what we did. This is followed by Teddy Roosevelt's Great White Fleet. This is President Roosevelt's announcement to the world that America is now a global power. The round-the-world cruise in 1907. You know, he wanted to do that in 1902. But you know, when you got 6 battleships, everybody yawns. You send 16 around the world, now the eyes open up. And that's exactly what he did. This is followed by April 6, 1917. That's the day Congress issues its declaration of war after Wilson asked for it on April 2nd. It took them 4 days to deliberate. But that day is one of the most important days in the history of this country. More important than Pearl Harbor Day. April 6th is more important than December 7th. Why? Because Congress codified what started with the War of 1898 and carried through with the Great White Fleet. America is now a global power. We are taking our place on the world stage. Wilson goes to France. Yeah, we are taking our place on the world stage, but he's the idealist here. He's the real idealist here. Interesting, he goes there with his 14 points, and I have the 14 points included in that handout, each and every one of them. But what they amount to is people will be able to determine their own fate. That's what this amounts to. You know, and when Wilson goes to France, he gets to Paris. How many presidents have had this kind of a reception? Over 1 million people. They line the motorcade. And as he's driving through Paris, they're all yelling, "Wilson, Wilson, Wilson." You could have heard it outside Paris. Guess who else heard it? Clemenceau. You know, Clemenceau is not misled here. Again, as an old-style European politician, he's not misled by American exceptionalism or American idealism. He saw blacks being lynched down south. And he tells that to Lloyd George. So let's not get overly excited here. All right? Plus, Clemenceau is looking for 2 things. 1, British and American support in the face of maybe a possible resurgent Germany. And he wants Germany taken apart, which he's not going to get. However, one of the real throwbacks here to the Napoleonic era is what happens. You know, this resurrection of a Czechoslovakia, Hungary, so on and so forth. These new states in Eastern and Central Europe, Poland being one of them. I'm going to get into Poland. This is what Clemenceau wanted. Why? As a buffer to the Soviet Union. Yet, what did Napoleon do? And I mentioned this last week for those people who weren't here last week. 1805, Napoleon destroyed the Holy Roman Empire. What did he replace it with? The Confederation of the Rhine? Yeah, 16 German states he organized as a buffer to what? Tsarist Russia. What's changed since 1805? Much change? No. No. One is Tsarist Russia, the other is a young Bolshevik Russia. Interesting. Yet, as these four men square off to decide the fate of Europe, again, it's interesting here. This idea of these 14 points, you know, and these guys don't all get along, you know. This wasn't a meeting that was all hunky-dory here. That's not how this worked. There was a lot of horse trading that was going on. There was a lot of backsliding, and there was a lot of insults traded here too. You know, it wasn't all peaches and cream here. At one point, this is interesting. At one point, George Clemenceau is so exasperated with these 14 points, he has to hear 1 million of his own countrymen yelling for Wilson, Wilson, Wilson. He gets into these meetings, he hears the 14 points, he finally tells Lloyd George, he goes, I am bored silly with Wilson's 14 points, why God Almighty only had 10 commandments. That's what he tells him. At one point, George Clemenceau is so concerned because of these 14 points, and because of people like Ho Chi Minh going to Versailles, believing in these 14 points, thinking that maybe Indochina might get its freedom. Isn't this what this means? People be able to determine their own fate. Guess what? He gets there and he's told, forget it. Your country is still going to remain part of the French colonial system. That kind of set the stage what's going to happen later on. If you're saying that, yeah, you'd be right. What happened to the Arabs? Lawrence of Arabia? Lawrence of Arabia was not a happy camper here, you know. And that begins when he finds out about the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916, and we're going to get into that one next week. One of the most perfidious documents in the 20th century. But again, there's a lot of backstabbing going on here as well at the same time. But Clemenceau is so concerned that he's going to lose his colonies that he tells Lloyd George, again about the 14 points. You know what Lloyd George tells him? It's interesting. Lloyd George tells him, don't worry, you'll still have access to your big nigger armies. It always mystifies me why we put our world leaders up here for. You know, they put their shoes on 1 foot at a time just like we do. You know, why bother? Yeah, don't be concerned, you still have your big nigger armies. Why? Because at the beginning of the First World War, Germany had access to 9.7 million men. France, 5.9 million. So guess where the French had, we're making up this manpower shortfall with their colonies. Senegalese, Moroccans. They impressed 50,000 men from Vietnam to put on French uniforms. And another 50,000 were taken from their families to move supplies on the Western Front. Picked up, put on ships, sent to the Western Front. You think the Vietnamese people like seeing their men being thrown into a European war? You think that's one of the reasons the Vietnamese got to hate the French? Yeah, pretty good reason to hate the French. Poland. Here's another one. Remember John Maynard Keynes? There's a whole school of economics named after him. He was a very young advisor to Lloyd George. The idea of a Poland comes up. Keep in mind, Poland had been wiped off the map in 1795 by Catherine the Great. That was the third partition of Poland. Became part of the Tsarist Russian Empire. Now Poland has a chance to come back. That's going to make the Russians real happy. But Poland has a chance to come back. Now, Lloyd George is ambivalent toward Poland. George Clemenceau wants it as a buffer zone to Bolshevik Russia. But, John Maynard Keynes isn't a big fan of this. But they're going to go along with the French. But John Maynard Keynes tells Lloyd George, get this one, Poland is an economic impossibility whose major export will be Jew baiting. That's what he tells them. Is he right? Well, Poles were not the biggest fans of Jewish people. And in 1919, the 1919-1921 Russo-Polish War, Poland's going to try to take more territory out of the carcass of Russia than they're supposed to be allotted at Versailles. And they go to war with the Poles. And guess what's one of the battlegrounds? Ukraine. This Polish army moves east while the Bolsheviks are having problems with the White Russians. Let's get them now. And while they're going into Ukraine, guess what they're doing? They are going to try to do what they can to get rid of their Jewish problem. They are slaughtering Jewish people by the bushel as they move east. Pogroms in full force. Maybe that's why, of course, they don't fashion to Ukrainians too well either. Interesting. When Ukraine was part of Tsarist Russia, guess who Tsarist Russia was using to keep the Ukrainian people in line? The Polish landed gentry. Now keep in mind, who are Ukrainians? Aren't a lot of those Eastern Orthodox? Who are the Poles? Catholic, right? You think they really like each other? Well, if they really like each other, then how come there's graffiti appearing in Western Ukraine? Right now, as I speak, there's graffiti on the buildings. Ukrainians will not be ruled by Russians, Poles, or Jews. Does this sound like the 1920s all over again? Yeah. How do you like being in that situation? Wonderful. But Leon Trotsky, the great orator, helps to organize the Red Army. One of the major contributors here is Mikhail Tukhachevsky, a rising star in the young Red Army. They pushed the Poles back, almost to the gates of Warsaw. It's a good thing the British and the French sent a lot of supplies to the Poles. They throw the Russians back. Line is stabilized, and Poland finally exists by 1921. Now, this is something Putin remembers, if many of us don't. One of the reasons he's fighting Ukraine, I don't give a darn what he says, he would like nothing better than to have Ukraine from the Dnieper River east. Why? Because they don't see the Cold War as fashioned in Berlin anymore. They see the Cold War centered in Ukraine, and they don't like it. But again, he understands that Germany invaded Russia in 1914, Poland invaded Russia in 1920, and then the big one, Hitler invades in 1941, and in less than 30 years, they lose 30 million people. We ever go through that? No. We have no clue what that's like. They do. That's their outlook. This is the atmosphere you are being thrust into now, no matter what you think of Putin. Can't disregard the history. But it's interesting what else happens here. Wilson. As I mentioned, some people wanted Wilson impeached. His job now, he's going to sign the Versailles Treaty. And what else? League of Nations, remember that one? An organization where these countries will discuss their problem instead of shooting them out? Well, George Clemenceau and Lloyd George aren't stupid. They know Wilson can sign any treaty he wants. Isn't there something in our Constitution that says that the Senate has to ratify same? Yeah. Is it going to be ratified? No. Who's going to lead the charge against that? Henry Cabot Lodge from Massachusetts, who can't stand Wilson and don't think the feeling's not mutual. And we're not going to ratify the Versailles Treaty. We're not going to become a member of the League of Nations. This is a tragedy. And it's actually one of the things that's going to help bring on what we call the Second World War. So we can probably take some of the blame for this. However, at the same time, let's understand one thing here. As I mentioned, April 6, 1917 is one of the most important days in American history. Why? Because we are acknowledged to be now a global power, yet the American public are not on board. You know, we went over there and helped the Europeans once. We don't want to go back. They're not on the same page with history at this point. Remember that term, isolationism? Yeah, okay. Well, there's an example of it. Happened after the Civil War. Happened right after the Civil War, after that 4-year bloodletting on our own shores. Of course, there is no such thing as isolationism for the banker and the businessman. He's still on the world stage. Keep in mind, we have 8,000 new millionaires because of this war. Your government grew 500% in this war. Between April 6, 1917 and Armistice Day, 1918, government spent over $22 billion. It spent more money than it did between 1793 and 1917. That's interesting. The age of big government has arrived. You know that thing the Republicans say they don't like? 2 world wars help it. It wasn't social programs, it was war. That's what built big government. And why? Don't you need a central authority to fight war on this level, a global war? That's what you have to have, government control. The British and the French went through the same thing. Russia. The Bolsheviks are eventually going to eke this out, and they're going to win that revolution. Of course, Lenin's going to die. You know, after an assassination attempt, dies of a stroke, 1924. After Lenin's gone, there's that tug of war for power between Trotsky and Stalin. Who's going to win this? Well, you would think Trotsky would, the brilliant orator, the brilliant party theorist. No, he's not. Why is he going to lose? Because he's not the backroom politician that Joe Stalin is. If you ever aspire to be a backroom politician, that's the man you want to. He puts Karl Rove to shame. Karl Rove's a choir boy. You want to learn how to be a backstabbing politician? Read Joe Stalin. That's the man you want to read, Joe Stalin. He had stationed all those portfolios with people allied to him. Portfolios in that Soviet government. So by 1926, who do you think's going to win at the party congress? Stalin. Germany. Germany, during the Versailles Treaty, or the discussions at Versailles, the idea of reparations. Germany's a basket case at this point. Going from being the most powerful nation in Europe now to an economic basket case. They're broke. Many figures were bandied about, 20 billion, 56 billion. They finally settled on $33 billion worth of reparations. Plus, Germany had to pay the entire Belgian war debt. How are they going to do that? They're broke. The Weimar Republic. They wanted to build a system of representative government. If the British and the French have a draconian approach to Germany, are they supporting representative government in Germany for a better Germany? No. What other mistake did they make? They did not dismantle the German general staff. That they did not do. Number one, the German general staff perpetuates the big lie. Did the Allies really invade Germany in 1918? No. Did they occupy it? Yeah, they occupied a small portion of it. Was it like 1945? Nowhere near. So the German general staff has told the people that the German army didn't lose the war. Who lost the war? Democrats, socialists, communists, and who else? The Jews. The 4 whipping boys. The German army comes through squeaky clean. Can everybody hear me in the back all right? Mm-hmm. You can? All right.
You know, the German army comes through this squeaky clean. The fact of the matter is, you know, at Versailles, the German army, even though the general staff survives, because of Versailles, the German army is reduced to 100,000 men. She cannot have tanks. She cannot have aircraft. God forbid she has submarines. You know what they did with that? Their navy. Germans cannot have a navy of any larger than 15,000 men. Capital ships, no larger than 10,000 tons. Battleships are approaching 35,000 tons now. German capital ships cannot have guns any larger than 11 inches. Cruisers, no larger than 6,000 tons. Guns, no larger than 6 inch. Heavy cruisers are 8 inch, have 8 inch guns and are 10,000 tons. The idea was to reduce the German Navy to a coastal force. That's the general idea. However, at the same time, Germany is having a problem internally, politically. The Weimar Republic can't solve the problem. You know, Bolshevik agitation, right versus left on the streets. And guess what? They're not going to use the German army to solve this problem. They're going to use the Freikorps. Anyone ever heard of them? The Freikorps. These guys were ex-soldiers, freebooters, guys out of work. And they're organized in different sections of the country, all right-wing, extreme right-wing, and they're armed by the army. God forbid the army dirties its hands in putting the workers in line. No, that's going to be the job of the Freikorps. Many of these guys in the Freikorps are going to wind up in the SA, the Sturmabteilung. What's that? Hitler's stormtroopers, right? The SA. And they're going to wean their teeth. They're going to cut their teeth on the streets. 1919, 1920, 1921, 1922. There's a lot of fighting going on in the German streets. The Rock Kampfverband, the Red Fighting Front. You know, the communists were making a bid here. God forbid communism takes power in Germany. You think the Prussian Junkers are going to like that one? No, they're going to cater to these squads of thugs in the streets to put the workers in line. In fact, in March 1919, these Freikorps go right through the working section of Berlin and kill thousands of German workers. And women and children. Makes no difference. Got to put them in line. That's how this works. Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, January 1919. You know, communist agitators who are brutally murdered by the Freikorps. Of course, that leads to Hitler's Munich Putsch in November of 1923. After which that fails, but he understands that he's going to have to try to take power legally. And where does he wind up? In Landsberg prison for 9 months. And what does he write? Mein Kampf, right. My battle and my struggle. And there he outlines what he wants to do. Interesting. You ever read this? You ever read the book? Anyone here ever read that book? Yeah, I read it a couple. Yeah. Interesting. Interesting book. He outlines what he wants to do. And I highlight this because especially in the East, Lebensraum, remember that one? Living space. For the Japanese, it's also known as Hakuichu, bringing the 8 corners of the world under one roof, the Japanese roof. But it's basically the same thing. It makes, you know, the face of fascism is the same, whether it's blue eyes and blonde hair or yellow skin and slanted eyes. The face of fascism is the same anyway. But the fact of the matter is, Hitler outlines what he wants and how he wants to support the 1,000-year Reich. Those lands in the East are going to supply this. And the people in the East, those Slavs, well, they're just going to labor under German overseers. That's what's going to happen. And he's going to put this idea into practice in 1941, 1942, and 1943 in places like Ukraine. That's the reason you had the war in the first place. He only took France and the Low Countries to protect his backside. Main event, the East. I just got done giving a talk on the Eastern Front this morning. This was the right weather for it. But the fact of the matter, America at this point, now that's interesting. The American bankers want to be paid back, right? They loaned out over $10 billion. They're not getting it back. Now, it becomes apparent on Wall Street, well, you know something? If Germany's having, economic problems, how are they supposed to pay off that debt? The French want to get paid. So do the Brits. So what does Wall Street do? They're gonna fix up Germany. Interesting. If they can fix up Germany, Germany will pay the debt. The British and the French will pay us. And that's what happens here. We build up Germany, and the Germans begin paying that debt back. And what's the dollar doing? That's what it's doing. We supply the Germans pay off the debt, the British and the French pay us, that money goes back plowed into Germany. Of course, that's going to work until the Depression, and then all bets are off at that point. However, there's one more thing about reparations that's interesting. Russia. It was actually written into the Versailles Treaty that Russia at a later date could actually put a bid in for reparations in Germany. Now keep in mind, the Soviets have been ostracized from European politics. And that's going to be the big thing I'm going to hit on when this is over tonight. Because there's two big powers that are ostracized here. The United States, because it wanted to be. The Soviet Union, because it had fallen sway to godless communism, God forbid. Yet Lenin, seeking political recognition for his Bolshevik state, contacts the British and the French, who have ostracized them from European politics. The magic word, we want to put in our bid for German reparations. Sure. Hiya, buddy. They're going to have a big conference in Italy. The British, the French, Tsars, the Bolshevik Russia. The Germans are invited. They're not going to take part in the discussions. They're just told, guess what? The Russians are going to put their bid in for reparations, and you're just going to take what's dished out. Well, what do you think the Germans now? They're like this. Well, guess what happens? Chicherin, Comrade Chicherin, the Soviet foreign minister, contacts the German delegation. He tells them, we don't want reparations. All we want is political recognition. And if you give us political recognition, we will give you the same. The Germans go for it. Lenin has pulled off the neatest political coup of the week, of the year, 1922. This is known as the Treaty of Rapallo, April 1922. This not only opens up political recognition, Germany and Russia, towards each other. The British are finally going to get the reality, well, we might as well recognize the Soviet Union, and so on and so forth. It concludes something more than that. Political recognition was nice. But later on, it's going to see an exchange of Russian finished goods to Germany and German finished goods to the Soviet Union. Finished goods that the Soviets need. It opens up something else. Military cooperation. Secret military cooperation between the two. German officers are going to the Soviet Union. They're opening up training centers deep in the bowels of Ukraine. And there's that name again. And they're actually opening up production centers. Germany's not supposed to have tanks, yet they're getting together with the Soviet Union to build prototypes. They're training air power. The Germans are relearning the rudiments of air power within the Soviet Union. They're not supposed to be doing this. Now you're probably asking, well, where are the military liaison from the West? Yeah, they're in Germany. They're not in Ukraine. This is all going on in secret. And this goes on until the early 30s, till Hitler stops this interaction. At the same time, there's one man who knows another war is coming and is going to be ready for it. He understands that his country in 1914, and I'm talking about Tsarist Russia, the least mobilized, the least organized, the least industrialized of all the major powers in 1914. And I mentioned this last week, that when Russia went to war in 1914, out of 6 million men mobilized, 4 million had rifles. And some of these only 4, 5, 6 rounds of ammunition per man. How the heck can you get into a world war this way? And the man that understands that is Joseph Stalin. Forced industrialization of the Soviet Union, beginning in 1928. Brings in American engineers, British engineers, French engineers, obviously German engineers, begins to build these factories. At the same time, he begins that program. Remember that the collectivization program to organize the peasants, which the peasants rebelled against, which in 5 years' time is going to see 3 to 5 million peasants starve to death.
Forced famine.
Yeah, that's it. Forced famine is right. Yeah. So where do some of these people go? Some of them start to gravitate toward the cities where these factories are being set up. This almost sounds like what went on in Europe after the French Revolution. With the snowballing of the Industrial Revolution? Yeah, sure does. Only now it's in Russia. Only now it's for a particular reason. This forced industrialization program in the Soviet Union, Stalin gears it toward what? Heavy industry. Tractor factories. Well, instead of using horses and mules to plow the field, why don't we use a tractor? However, what can a tractor factory be converted to?
Tanks.
Tanks. That's it. Tanks. This is an example of Stalin's approach to heavy industry. Now, to do this is interesting. He underpays the people. He underpays them. Overcharges them for the shoddy goods that they're going to buy, and then plows the excess, or in the Marxist terminology, surplus value, plows it back into the system to make more factories. By 1940, in 12 years, the Soviet Union is the world's second-ranking industrial power.
Really?
The second-ranking industrial power. And I'm going to tell you something. We all talk about American production in World War II, but understand one thing. Understand one thing. Soviet industrial production is one of the biggest secrets for Allied victory in the Second World War. Because when that war starts and Hitler invades the Soviet Union, the Soviets will beat the Germans largely unaided. No matter what you understand about Lend-Lease, the Russians are going to beat them largely by themselves. Yep. Largely by themselves. You know, we kind of get all bought. Now, this isn't to disparage the American production. Who else could make 296,000 aircraft in World War II? Who else can make 71,072 Navy vessels in 5 years? Everything from landing craft to flat tops. We made over 2,600,000 trucks, over 2,600,000 machine guns. Who else can do that? Yet the Soviets are going to build 158,000 warplanes in World War II. We build 102,000 tanks, they build 121,000. We build 250,000 artillery pieces, they're going to build 500,000.
Wow.
This was the Soviet Union. Of course, having said that, you're probably sitting there, well, what the hell possessed the Germans, Japanese, and Italians to go to war with the two of our world's largest industrial powers? What the hell were they smoking?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, that's the question you have to ask. Of course, it's how we get there at this point. But this is what Stalin starts. He understands this. Another man who understands it when he becomes president, that there's another war coming, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Yeah, Franklin D. Roosevelt. He understands, remember, he was assistant to the Secretary of the Navy in World War I, Josephus Daniels. He understood America wasn't ready to fight the First World War. We weren't ready. The two biggest things we gave the Allies in World War I were men, which the French were crying for. Men, 2,086,000 finally made it to the Western Front by Armistice Day. And the other thing was that one resource that revolutionized war in the First World War, but will dominate it in the Second, oil. 80% of the oil burned by the French army in 1918 and the Royal Navy came from where?
Ukraine.
Here. Here. Came from here. Because the convoy system beat the U-boat. Sure, the British were pumping it out of Persia, but it was a lot more convenient to go 3,000 miles straight across the Atlantic from the United States to Britain and then to France. Keep in mind, a lot of it went to France because France, at this time you were seeing now, armies move off horse-drawn transport to motorized transport. That means what? Oil versus gasoline. That means the truck. You are seeing that happen now in the First World War. Airplanes, right? Can't fly them on the water. So oil was necessary. What was it Lord Curzon said in 1918, 1919? God bless you.
Thank you.
1918, 1919. The Allies won the First World War because they floated to victory on a sea of oil. Interesting, isn't it?
Wasn't Winston Churchill made the comment that when he enlarged the British Navy as the Sea Admiral, he said, "Oh, we float on a bed of oil."
That's it.
Because
They were making that jump from coal to oil,
most
just
of
like
the-
we did.
most of the oil was coming from Iran, and they
Yeah,
knew
Persia,
how,
right.
and Persia, and they knew how to protect their resources over in Iran.
Well, I'm going to get into more of that next week when I talk about Iraq, because that has a lot to do with this.
We're
That has
in,
a lot to do with this. Yes.
we're in the United States, is the oil coming from?
Pennsylvania, Texas. Keep in mind when it comes to oil, the Russians were the world's leading producer till about 1900. After that, the United States was. In 1918, almost 75% of the world's output of oil was coming from this country. The mid 1920s, 70 to 72% of the oil was. Mid 1930s, 63 to 65% of oil pumped was coming from this country. Now, the fascinating aspect of this is, in 1938, the last full year of peace before the resumption of the Civil War, the European Civil War, Germany burned 46 million barrels of oil. Britain burned 76 million barrels. Stalin, or the Soviet Union, going under that program of forced industrialization, burned 183 million barrels. You know how many America burned in 1938? 1.2 billion barrels.
0.2 billion?
1.2 billion.
Wow.
America was using oil for purposes other than transportation. Keep in mind, who else was building as many cars? The United States, right? It's cheap oil and gas. If it wasn't for cheap oil and gas, you wouldn't have New Canaan like it is today. That built suburbia. Better start thinking when gasoline goes to $10 a gallon, how long suburbia is going to last, if it goes that high, if it ever does. Gasoline, that is. But the fact of the matter is, that's why Norton. That's why where I come from, Norwalk. It's cheap gas. That's what built suburbia in this country. It's all part of it. However, keep in mind too, during the Second World War, 6 of every 7 barrels of oil burned by the Allies came from this country, except for the Soviet Union. But as the 30s roll on here, who comes to power in Germany? Hitler. Hitler. He's the ultimate heir to the Kaiser. However, in the United States, Eisenhower, it's Franklin D. Roosevelt that sees another war is coming. However, can he buck the tide of isolationism? No. But again, he understands that in the First World War, except for oil and manpower, what else did we give? Not really anything. Interesting. When in fact, the Army came out with these figures. During the First World War, American doughboys and Marines used 2,251 artillery pieces. You know how many were made here? 130. That's it. That's it. 8,850,000 rounds of artillery ammo they fired. Guess how many came from this country? 208,000.
Where's it come
It's interesting, the French were all excited when America got into the war. Wow, boy, with that economic dynamo, we can have 23,000 tanks by next summer, 1918. You know how many tanks America made? 26. You know how many made it to the Western Front by Armistice Day? 15. Our boys were using British and French tanks. That's what they were using. So America supplied the manpower. So don't think this is an accident. It's interesting. When Roosevelt becomes president, don't think this is an accident that the first B-17 for World War II flies in 1935. Don't think this is an accident when the first of the new fast battleships is laid down in America's yards in 1937. The first B-24, Liberator, flies in 1939. The new American Essex-class flat tops, which is going to lead that effort across the Central Pacific during the Second World War, they're authorized in 1940. You think that's an accident? You better not think it is. Roosevelt knew war was coming. One other man knew it was coming.
Marshall.
Well, no, he's not. Yeah,
Churchill.
Churchill. So do you think it's an accident that Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill are going to be the big three? No. No. However, it's interesting. Stalin is interesting. He takes a look at Europe. You know, here's Hitler when he comes to power a year later. Do you know he made a non-aggression pact with the Poles? 1934. Hitler's not stupid. He takes a look at a map. Germany, Poland, France. Well, let's make sure France is ostracized from the Poles, and we'll sign a non-aggression pact with the Poles. Stalin sees this and says, well, we can't have this. So what does he do? He joins the League of Nations, throwing his lot with the British and the French. But as Hitler gains power, and as Hitler expands German power, you go back to the Rhineland in 1936 when he remilitarized it. On March 7, 1936, in direct contravention of the Versailles Treaty, the Rhineland, that border entity in Germany, on the French frontier was not supposed to be militarized. He sends 2 battalions there. His generals were like this. The French can mobilize 100 divisions. And his general said, well, what happens if the French mobilize? And Hitler says, well, we pull out.
Yeah, and they didn't,
We pull out. That's it, they don't. The French don't mobilize.
because they believe in
Chalk up one for Hitler. Chalk up one for Hitler. 1937 instigates trouble in Austria. 1938 is the Anschluss. 1938 as well. What happens to Sudetenland, that part of Czechoslovakia where the Germans live? It's attached to the German Reich. You know, and Chamberlain goes back home, waving that paper, peace in our time. I'm sure you've seen that newsreel footage.
the Munich Accord.
Yeah, really, yeah, that's right. Him, Daladier, and Mussolini. You know, the Italians have already gobbled up Abyssinia. The Germans and Italians are already meddling in the Spanish Civil War, which is eventually going to be won by Franco, who's another fascist. The Japanese are marching in the Pacific. 1931, they had invaded Manchuria. 1937, they invade China proper. 1940, they go into northern French Indochina with the acquiescence of Vichy France, who was ordered to allow that by the Nazis. 1939, the Hitler-Stalin pact. Why? Because Stalin no longer trusts the British and the French. He thinks the British and the French want the Nazis and the Soviets to fight. So he signs that pact with Hitler. Now Hitler can wipe Poland off the map. After 20 years of existence, there is no real Poland anymore. It's gone. It's gone. What happened to Versailles? Yeah, that's it.
Ignored.
That's it, ignored. Ignored, trampled, torn up. What did
Trampled.
Hitler once say of it? It's a piece of paper. Yeah. So what happened to those 8.5 million men that got killed on the Western Front? What the hell did they die for?
Very little.
Well, it would seem so. It would seem so. America. America right now is staying out of this war that started in 1939, but it's generally a European civil war. Hitler is going to clean up in Europe. He's going to steamroller the Poles. He's going to beat the Norwegians and the Danes. He's going to swallow up France and the Low Countries, which surprised Stalin. Stalin thought, and he hoped, that Germany would be stuck here for months, if not years. But everyone seemed to forget what Hitler once said. The next war will not be fought like the last war. And on May 10, 1940, when he invades France, Hitler is fighting to the timetable of 1940, not 1914 like the French. It's a wake-up call. France falls in 6 weeks.
Wow.
Everyone was stunned. The great French army. Interesting. The tank, which showed promise in the First World War, really shows what it could do in the Second World War. Instead of having these tin Lizzies and pot-belly stoves that do 3 or 4 miles an hour, they've got competent gun platforms that can do 30 miles per hour plus. It's a different world in 24 years. In 20 years. It's a different world. Warfare has advanced to that point. Air power, in conjunction with land power, has changed the face of war. (1941), the big one. Hitler invades the Soviet Union, starting the greatest land war there's ever been. This is where the land campaign for the entire Second World War will be decided. This issue will not be decided in the Pacific. It will not be decided in North Africa. It will not be decided in Sicily, Italy, or France. Even after Normandy, the main event of the Second World War on land will be in the East. End of discussion. Because when Hitler invades the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941, he hurls 3.3 million men, 139 divisions, 3/4 of the German army against that Soviet colossus. Amazing. The very first day of this invasion, the very first, when you talk about Pearl Harbor, if you're an American, you understand we lost 183 planes that day. That's nothing to be proud of. June 22nd, 1941, the Luftwaffe destroys 1,400 Soviet aircraft, 600 the next day. In 48 hours, they wipe out 2,000 aircraft. Almost the entire front line strength of the world's largest air force wiped out.
Wow.
The first day, 3 Soviet infantry divisions. I'm not talking battalions, regiments, and brigades. I'm talking divisions wiped out. 5 others cut to pieces. 100,000 men, 24 hours off the board. In a week, Heinz Guderian, that great practitioner of armor, is already 1/3 the way to Moscow. He's over 200 miles inside the Soviet Union. In a week. In 2 weeks, the Soviets have more dead than America will lose in the entire war. Plus lose another 1 million taken prisoner. In a month, the Germans have taken an area twice the size of their own country. Now, this is not a defeat in the making. This is an unmitigated disaster. That's what this is. Churchill, an absolute foe of Bolshevism, says to Stalin he'll help him. Whatever help the British can give, whatever meager help the British can give at this point, they will support. He's criticized for this. Of course, what's Churchill's reply? If Hitler invaded hell, I would make a favorable reference to the devil in Parliament. Leave it to Winston Churchill. He was interesting. The day Pearl Harbor got bombed, that happens in the morning, right? Well, you go through the time zones, it's getting to be night in London. And there's a big dinner party. John J. Winnett, remember him? U.S. ambassador to England. Interesting. An adjutant comes into this dinner party. The host is Winston Churchill. And, Churchill reads this missive, he hands it over to Winnett. Winnett's eyes get as big as his glasses. And Churchill goes, and his adjutant comes over, pencil and paper, and he writes out this declaration of war. And, you know, when it says, my God, aren't you gonna wait for confirmation here? Churchill wasn't waiting for nothing. He was so hot to trot for America to get into this war, he wasn't waiting. But he uses the most polite, wonderful language to phrase this declaration of war. And he signs it, your most obedient servant, Winston S. Churchill. And, you know, the adjutant says, well, you know, why are we so polite here? Why is it phrased? And Churchill's response is, when you have to kill a man, it costs you nothing to be polite. And off it goes. And now Britain was at war with Japan. But on the Eastern Front, where this is going to be do or die here, do you know what the Soviets did as the Germans are advancing? The Soviets tear down, by Stalin's orders, the Soviets tear down 1,546 factories in Western Russia, throw them on 18,000 trains and send them east with 16 million workers.
They pull back.
Well, yeah, they wanted to save those factories. Where do they go? Behind the Urals, beyond the range of the Luftwaffe. This is a country that knows it's not just losing a war, it's backs to the wall. There's a story of a Yak factory, Yakolev aircraft, if anyone's familiar with Russian aircraft. And that factory was torn down, put on the trains, and sent east. From the time it was put on the trains and sent east, almost 1,000 miles, by the time it gets to the Urals, it's broken down off the trains, and it's built up, and it's back into production. From the time it was loaded to the time it was in production, 7 days.
Wow. From scratch.
Yeah, 7 days. Does that tell you this country knows its back's to the wall? Yes. However, Hitler is going to make some mistakes on the Eastern Front. And outside Moscow, December 1941, Georgy Zhukov, that great Soviet commander, is going to launch a huge counterattack because the Germans, they don't have the proper lubricants and so on and so forth for their engines. They thought the war would be over by this point. Hitler wanted this invasion over in 17 weeks. Georgy Zhukov launches a big counterattack, and this counterattack occurs on a front 650 miles wide. It's 40 degrees below zero.
Wow.
Germans are dying because their anal pores are congealing and they can't relieve themselves. That's how cold it is. Ask an American GI who was in North Korea in that winter of 1950. He'll tell you. It's not much different there. But Zhukov is able to throw the Germans back at least 100 miles, in some places 150 miles or more. That's December 4-5, 1941. What happens 2 days later? The Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor. Who's in the war now? The United States. This is your turning point of what you call the Second World War. The turning point is not Midway. The turning point is not Stalingrad. The turning point is not El Alamein. The turning point is December 1941. Why? Because the complexion of the war changed. It's no longer a European conflict. It is now a global war. A global war Germany, Italy, and Japan are nowhere near equipped to wage. The war, which started in 1914, has now blossomed into this global conflict, a real global conflict, of which only 2 countries are able to fight. The United States and the Soviet Union. The 2 countries that were ostracized from European politics in 1919. The Europeans aren't going to win this war, my friends. The outsiders will. The United States and the Soviet Union. They are going to win this war. And why are they going to win this war? Because they got the 3 things it takes to win a war on this level. 1, large populations. That's especially true with the Soviet Union. You know, keep in mind, you know, we go into the Second World War with 132 million people. 132 million people. If you go to the Navy Department, we lose 405,399 dead. Now take the morality out of those figures. That's only 1/3 of 1%. That's not much. Where I work, I know generals who will pay 1/3 of 1% of the American population to get what America got out of the war. Soviet Union? 190 191 million people in 1941. Between June 22nd, 41 and May 7, 45, they're going to lose upwards of 25 million.
25
25 million in 47 months. But of course we're talking Stalin, he doesn't care anyway. I want what I want, and the discussion. That's how this is. The second thing they have, large industrial infrastructure. I alluded to this earlier. In the United States we all know about, but don't sell the Soviets short. And the third thing they have, and they had an abundance, indigenous supplies of oil, unlike any other participant in the war.
vast sums of oil.
And what happened here? They have the oil. They didn't have to go get it. The Germans, the Japanese, and the Italians had to go get it. You think it's an accident they lose the war? No. Yes.
The 25 million that you cited that the Russians lost, were those the soldier, the military population?
Everybody.
Okay.
Oh, well, that's not exact. There are military historians who say the Russians lost 22 million. I've seen figures as high as 27 to 28 million.
Because when you take a look at the months.
There's no way of exactly
No,
counting this.
I mean, the population died of hunger and starvation and disease.
Well, that's true. I mean, if you, in fact, I went into this morning. If you look at the invasion of the Soviet Union, from June 22nd, 41, to when there was a hiatus here in March 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 1942. Both sides needed a rest. In that short period of time, the Soviets already had 2 million battlefield dead. Now, they already had almost 4 million more guys taken prisoner. Yet, by this short period of time, over 2.5 million of them were dead. So the Soviets already have 4.5 million dead. That doesn't count the civilians yet. We're just talking military. Yet, in 1942, Germany makes 5,997 tanks. You know how many the Soviets made in 1942 without our help? 24,446. 13,500 of them was a T-34. The best tank made by the Allies in the Second World War. Made the Sherman look like a piece of junk, which the Sherman was by comparison. The British used to call the Sherman the Ronson Lighter. One hit. Yeah. I think that made the Sherman, there was a lot of them. That's what made the Sherman. But this is what you're seeing. So take American production out of this. You think the Germans are going to win this? No. And then you get to the Battle of Stalingrad. You get to the Battle of Kursk, the greatest air-land battle in history. Operation Bagration in 44. This is what kills the Germans on land. These are the battles that kill the Germans, not El Alamein. El Alamein's a turning point in the Desert War. But here we're just talking a few divisions. Eastern Front, we're talking armies. Where on the Western Front, hundreds of tanks were maneuvering. On the Eastern Front, it's thousands. It's astounding, absolutely astounding. You know, we don't know what this is like. We have no clue. Thank God. Thank God. But you know, but at the end of the war, it's going to be the United States and the Soviet Union that win this war. So a war that starts in 1914, and that's why I call this the Great War. The war starts 1914 by the European colonial powers. Sure, it comes to a rest in 1918, but Hitler jumpstarts it in 39, and it's over in 45, but the winners are not the Europeans. They're who? The United States and the Soviet Union. The old line colonial powers no longer hold sway in the world. You know, you lived through it, it's called the Cold War. It's a new world. Spheres of influence, United States, Soviet Union. The world's changed. It's fascinating what started at the French Revolution with all these ideas like liberalism, democracy, republicanism, socialism, secularism, nationalism, so on and so forth. Unleashed this war in 1914. Yet the globe changes by 1945. Actually, 1942, the United States and the Soviet Union begin to take this war over. Now, how many of these colonial powers are left to fight? Who, Britain? You know, and what does Britain get out of the war? Well, they get the recognition of having survived the Blitz. You know, but as a colonial power, they're done. They're done. The world has passed them by. And this is the legacy you're left with. Interesting how the world has transformed itself since 1914. And yet, and you come back next week, we do Iraq. That's going to be a different problem. But you see, you actually see that even with Ukraine today as an example. Have we advanced much beyond 1918? No. No. So it's like I told my kid, when I had those 2 Marines over, I had my son over who put 2 combat tours in Iraq, and this fellow who put 3 tours as a Marine sniper in Vietnam, lived with the Montagnards in the jungles, on and off for 3 years. I used to get a kick out of it. Danny Caparell is his name. He's big in the veteran affairs in Norwalk. Big. I mean, he's really a big booster for the vets. And I remember Danny telling me, he says, we get, the Huey helicopter, he says, we go to rappel down from 20, 30 feet up into the jungle. He said, the Montagnards would jump out of the helicopter. Jump 20, 30 feet up? And he said, yeah. And he says, the grubs, and Danny ate grubs in the jungle. He says, but at least I cooked them. But that's who you're fighting with. And he says, they're great people. But I'm listening to these 2 guys talk. I'm listening to my son who put 2 tours in Iraq, and this guy put 3 in the jungles of Vietnam, and I'm listening to these 2 Marines talk. And, it's interesting to listen to the differences and commonalities from a 66-year-old to a 26-year-old. Both Marines. I can't say ex-Marines, I'll get shot. Once you're in the Marines, you're never out. It's like being in the mafia. So they're going on for about 20, 30 minutes, and I finally said to him, I said, can I jump in here for a moment? I said, I know I work at Army Aviation Magazine, I don't even deserve to be here. But I said, but my father was a World War II Navy vet, so I said, technically, we own you. Navy Department. And I said to him, I said, you guys, this is terrific. Listening to 2 combat vets talk like this. But I said, you're missing one thing. What? I said, you guys are still fighting World War I. What? I said, well, Iraq is a product of World War I / colonialism. Vietnam, World War I / colonialism. And they both go, oh yeah. And my son goes, Jesus. And finally, especially on my son, he says, this stuff never ends. I said, no, Eric, it doesn't. I said, so what your grandfather did, what Danny did in Vietnam, you're still doing in Iraq. How does it feel? Interesting. Yes?
So you're saying there's actually a common thread through all this?
Yes.
Really,
Yes, there is.
really even before World War I, but World War I, World War II, Vietnam, this common kind
Go
of
in
thread.
Korea. That's part of this.
Korea, this common thread of colonialism and dividing up these large parcels of land and the conflicts and everything that go on, there's a common thread to these
If you take a look at history, go back to the American and French revolutions, okay? What were they? They were the ideas of the Age of Reason and Age of Enlightenment put into action. That's what they were, okay? But if you take a look, if you really sat down and you laid these things, women ought to know this, crocheting, right? What do? You make your loops, right? And then you throw a main line through the loops and tighten it. Now you get an idea. Well, I'm making a shawl. I'm making a towel. History's no different. Take these events and line them up, and then draw a line through them. Oh yeah, this one leads to this. This leads to this. This leads to this. I do this all the time. And it's amazing what you can discern when you do it that way. It's amazing. Instead of looking at these things individually. There's a progression here, and that progression is no accident. Why? Because you're talking about man, for Pete's sakes. Then you're going to say, well, history repeats itself. Yeah, if you do this. Geez, didn't they do this 300 years ago? Yeah. What did we learn?
Nothing.
Does that frustrate you, knowing that all this lays out before you so plainly, and I guess a bit
Hell
of
no,
history-
because if someone figures this out, I'm out of a job.
Oh.
Once man starts fighting, I'm done.
Stops fighting.
Yeah, once they stop fighting, I'm done.
Now, we'll still be building stuff that we don't need.
Yes.
What was Hitler's rationale for taking on Russia in 1941,
I think
rather
Hitler,
than waiting for some more propitious time.
well, you sound like you sound like a few of his generals who said, well, why would we want to invade the Soviet Union for with Britain still not having surrendered?
It's an open-faced, double-faced war.
The idea,
Both sides.
right, and a couple of his generals told him, well, we'd be repeating the mistake we made in 1914, God bless you, a two-front war,
And Napoleon.
which Hitler originally argued that Germany wouldn't do. Problem here was, Hitler says that a quick campaign in Russia, despite the fact that Britain had not surrendered, a quick campaign in Russia would be the only active front. And if we can defeat the Soviets quickly, 17 weeks is what he wanted this done, that Britain would see continued resistance as being futile. Hitler also saw that eventually that the Britain and the United States would get together with Russia, and that's what he wanted to eliminate. The problem here is he meddled too much. And, somebody like Georgy Zhukov, Heinz Guderian, he wanted to go straight to Moscow. And
Why
Hitler
didn't
goes, my God, my tank's that far deep, that's his best his armor.
Why didn't they?
And Guderian tried to tell him, well, the Luftwaffe can keep me supplied, I'll build temporary airfields as I'm going along, and they can supply me with men, arms, ammunition, food, and I'll keep going. Does that sound like Patton in the George C. Scott in the movie Patton? Okay, it's the same thing. This is what Guderian is telling him. Hitler says, no. Keep in mind, somebody like Guderian, Ewald von Kleist, Hasso von Manteuffel, these are great names in armored warfare. Great names. Yet, keep in mind, these guys were thinking ahead. You've got this thing called the tank. We don't use horse cavalry anymore. We now have the tank. This is the new form of mobile warfare. Let's use it. Yet you understand that some other generals like Fyodor von Bock, Ritter von Lieb, Hitler himself was trained. They were trained as artillerymen and infantrymen. They weren't trained in this type of mobile warfare. So somebody like Heinz Guderian could be considered heretical. Sure, we'll go 200 miles behind the Soviet Union and surround large blocks of Soviet troops, which Hitler did, but instead of going straight across, no.
Why? Why didn't he?
Hitler wasn't as audacious as some people give him credit for. Yes.
When you take a look at Hitler, there's so much of the nationalism creed that's tossed into the melange between World War I and World War II. And also, when you take a look at Hitler himself as a personality, whether he was a megalomaniac or a sociopath, he had these delusions of grandeur, and to a certain extent, that really pushed him. I mean, the European powers, they just stopped. They thought appeasement would work with Hitler for a short amount of time.
Well, that didn't work.
It didn't work, and so Hitler, beyond his lunacy, because he really wasn't sane, just kept pushing forward, forward. And anyone that got in his way amongst his upper corps, he got rid of them.
Well, yeah. You're right to a certain extent. I mean, Hitler was he was an egotist.
Megalomaniac.
Well, yeah. But even Patton was an egotist. Montgomery was an egotist. MacArthur, we know, was an egotist. But I mean, yeah,
Great men. If they're leaders, they
Right.
have to have a very,
Okay.
very large
Yeah,
ego.
right. Lawrence of Arabia had an ego. But Hitler was in a position of authority to exercise that ego to how he saw fit.
Exactly.
He was also following the blueprint he laid out in Mein Kampf, which many other people didn't bother to read it. Well, it was a jumbled mass of ideas that aren't very comprehensive. Really? Not comprehensive? Huh. Help change the world. But you are quite right, you are seeing this nationalism which go back, I mentioned this last week, going back in the 19th century, this anti-German, anti-Slav outlook was put into action with Hitler. You know, these Slavs, these Ukrainians are just going to be, slaves to German overseers. And we're gonna take the wheat, we're gonna take the bread, we're gonna take the cattle, and we're gonna leave these people hardly anything.
He hated the Slavs.
Well, yeah,
He hated
they were subhuman. Untermensch in the German word.
No, he didn't hate the British.
No, he had an affinity. In fact, you wanna know something about Heinrich Himmler? The SS, the Lord of the, I don't see how he is the German ideal for the SS.
Yeah.
I
A
mean,
chicken farmer.
Well, that's where, yeah, the ex-chicken farmer with the pince-nez glasses. He thought, now get this is this nationalist idea. I don't, who the hell comes up with these cockamamie ideas? But, you know, Himmler's a gent, he really is. He thought that he wanted German women to produce more than one child at a time. He thought that the Scottish people were examples of a proper Nordic type. And he thought because Scottish women ate porridge, this made them fertile. So they had these houses, Anenerby houses they called them, and these women were supposed to be sired by SS guys, and they thought that these women ate porridge, they would produce more than one child. The only thing they got was fat. Even the women complained. You know, I have a child here and I'm not losing this weight. Well, let's stay off the porridge. I mean, these are some of the cockamamie ideas going back to Hitler. You know, some of his followers were coming up with. Dr. Ferdinand Porsche was another one. Brilliant guy. He's making 180-ton land monitors when he should be making 30, 40-ton tanks. Why are you wasting your time for? You know, there's no priority here. The Americans had priority. The Sherman tank might have been a piece of junk, but we made over 49,000 of them. Who's going to win the war? The Allies. No accident here. No accident here. Yes?
Getting back to your first lecture, when you spoke about the various isms,
Oh, yeah.
colonialism, imperialism, then later globalism. What is the salient difference between colonialism, imperialism, and then later on globalism?
Well, in colonialism is where you go into a country like the British went into what they're going to call Iraq, and they're going to colonize it. They're going to take what they can out of that country and use the people for what they want to use them for.
Why isn't that imperialism then?
That's still imperialism. Of course, if you're looking at just Iraq, that's colonialism there. If you're looking at Persia, that's colonialism there. The overall program is imperialism.
And globalism is basically
It's doing this on a global scale, but it doesn't have. But the American Empire is not based really on what the British and the French did. A lot of it today is based on finance, Wall Street. Sure, we got troops in different countries, but where's the real power? For America, the real power starts with Bretton Woods in 1944. The post-war world will rely on the dollar. You know how much power that gave us? Wow. One of the reasons we cannot afford not to let the dollar no longer be the world's reserve currency, which is why one of the reasons it is the world's reserve currency today is because it's the currency mainly for oil transactions. Here we are again. Now you're probably going to say, well then, you know, if we're becoming so-called self-sufficient in oil, you know, the fracking and so on and so forth, what do we need to be in the Middle East for? It makes no difference if we're not getting any oil out of the Middle East. Don't you want the dollar to remain the world's reserve currency?
Yeah.
Okay. That means you're going to have to send young Americans to fight and die in the Middle East. It's that simple, folks. That's how this works. You might not want to hear that. You think Himes is going to tell you that? You think Murphy's going to tell you that? You think your president's going to tell you that? Okay. Let's understand reality here. And where does that all come from? World War I. We assumed the mantle on Valentine's Day, I remember my wife, I don't know if I mentioned that here, my wife asked me one time, she says, what is your most vivid recollection of Valentine's Day? I said, well, I can't use the Clark Street garage in 1929 in Chicago, that won't sound good at all.
You're smart enough not to answer that question.
Yeah, doggone right, I gotta eat. Although I always kid my wife about her cooking, I said, how many people in East Norwalk, you know, say grace after dinner? But But the fact of the matter is, I knew
a lot with you.
Yeah, she sure does. I mean, how many other guys eat meatloaf that glows in the dark? But the fact of the matter is here, I said, the Valentine's Day. Okay, how about Abdulaziz Ibn Saud and Franklin D. Roosevelt meeting on the light cruiser Quincy off Bitter Lakes, Egypt, and the two consummating the deal? American military protection for Saudi Arabia versus preferential access to Saudi crude, and every president, be he Democrat or Republican, has made no difference, has catered to that agenda ever since.
And what year was that?
Valentine's Day, 1945. That was one of the last things Franklin D. Roosevelt ever did. Interesting.
Was to make a deal with Saudi Arabia for.
Correct. Why? Because Franklin D. Roosevelt, again, going back to the two big winners of the Second World War, both were self-sufficient in oil, but Roosevelt wasn't stupid. He knew in the coming Cold War, somebody had to take control of oil. And it better be us, whether we have our own or whether it's in other countries. Now you wonder why you're in the Middle East? Yeah. It's interesting, too, because doesn't Putin have a Navy base in Syria? Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yep. Henceforth, the reason he grabbed the Crimea in the first place. That's that warm weather access to the Mediterranean.
Right.
So what you see in the Middle East is tied to what's going on in Ukraine.
Where in Syria is it?
Tartus. It's on the Mediterranean coast.
We have time for maybe one more question.
One more question. Yes.
But if we become more independent in terms of our energy needs for the 21st century, then in terms of, i.e. shale production, and you see the price of oil dropping quite a bit, and the OPEC nations really not setting or capping a price or moving in on that.
Saudi Arabia doesn't want to.
And I don't really know why, but with this growing independence and this devaluation of oil, how does that play into your idea that oil seems to be so important as we're trying to get more independence from foreign oil? And
Who said temporary?
It's very temporary.
Yeah, it is. And what you're seeing here is interesting. All that fracking that's going on in the Dakotas, a lot of those guys that borrowed money to do that drilling, borrowed money when oil was $80, $90, $100 a barrel. It's now $47.50, $49.50. You don't think they're losing money? Now the backlash to this is, keep in mind, with the dollar as the world's reserve currency, and the dollar used mainly to finance oil transactions. I mean, if Thailand wants to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, they use the buck. If Swaziland wants to buy oil from Iran, they use the buck. The advantage here is all these different countries got to keep dollars in their central bank tills. Now, besides using it to buy oil, maybe some of those dollars will come back to this country to buy American goods and services. Or how about some of those dollars are soaked up to buy treasury notes, treasury bills, certificates of deposit? What does that mean?
Low interest.
Yeah, but doesn't that mean financing American debt? Okay, what's going to happen to that debt when the dollar is no longer the world's reserve currency?
It'll go right up.
What's going to happen to Social Security? What's going to happen to Medicare? What's going to happen to this? What's going to happen to that? I don't need to draw you a picture, folks.
so it's really the connection with the dollar, according to being the international trade currency for oil and all that makes it
That's a lot of it.
so paramount.
So there's a benefit to us that it's temporary. If it was forever, you'd see the economic
Well,
pendulum
as
swing the
this
other
gentleman
way.
was alluding to, it's temporary. However, how long is temporary going to be? 5 years can be temporary, in the scheme of things. However, that said, keep in mind, if countries like Saudi Arabia, which can weather this, Venezuela cannot, Nigeria cannot, Iraq can, now we're back to Iraq now, Iraq cannot.
What about
So
Iran?
some of those excess
Iran?
dollars that they used to send here, if they can no longer send them here, what happens to our debt? Does that mean the Republicans are going to say, well, you guys don't need Social Security, you don't need this, you don't need that?
Well, they're saying it now.
Of course they are. Of course they are. And it's not just it's not just
I know.
Republicans. Don't be misled by that music. All right? So, yes, and this goes back to what? World War I. You know, it's like dropping a rock in a pond and like the ripples go out 360 degrees. You know, is it gonna get any better in the Middle East?